Now, let's look at the other side, when limitations hinder rather than help. In the jazz world, there was a schism in the 60s, when there was this influx of radically new approaches to the music, and many people who liked the old approaches discounted this new music from actually being jazz at all. There's a whole complex discussion around that, because some of those folks also didn't like the word jazz itself. I'm oversimplifying to be concise, but basically, a new school came around, the old school said no, which is a story that's been repeating itself since art first started, and a story we've probably all seen somewhere. But the difference here is that this new school, unlike cool and hard and bebop and big band and New York before it, never fully came into vogue. It never became the main driving force of the genre. Does that sound familiar? Then the 70s rolled around. Rock was in full swing and was quickly taking over as the new most popular music in America. And in the spirit of the freedom of expression the previous decade had championed, some jazz musicians responded to this by merging their craft with rock and roll. There were varying degrees of success, which I think is less because it couldn't be done and more because some musicians weren't ready to do it. But again, that's another conversation. Ready or not though, the players making fusion music, as it was called, had started a movement that some folks born in the 80s and 90s actually embraced because they had grown up listening to genre bending. Music without limits. Enter the limiter.
Good evening, and happy Black History Month. I don't care if the government doesn't celebrate it. We still do here. And welcome to a very special video on the channel, one that I've wanted to do basically since I started doing the web show. Now, when I was in grad school, I became very interested in the idea of historiography, which for those who don't know is basically the history of something. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see how that's important, since the reasons behind why we remember something the way that we do is often part of the history of the thing itself. And more important than that, it's often a pretty crucial part that gets left out, sometimes deliberately. So tonight's going to be a mix of history, historiography, and anecdotes of my own. The bulk of what we're looking at tonight is jazz as it existed in the 1960s, specifically the music that's usually omitted from those discussions, why it's omitted, and how that's important to us today. Because believe it or not, the idea of blackness back then and how it affected the music that got talked about has everything to do with the idea of blackness today. But before we get into this, a couple of disclaimers. One, I'm not going to be singing everybody's praises tonight. You might disagree with some or even all of the opinions I present here, and that's okay. But just understand that I'm presenting them alongside well-documented, fully researched facts. So even if you disagree with my perspective, you'll still learn something. Two, nobody really wants to hear criticisms of their community from outside the community. We all love the Boondocks for how funny it is, but a lot of people also forget about how controversial it was because of how many people within the black community it called out. And because it was a black creator of the show who clearly loved his people, rather than feeling slighted as a race, it actually promoted some interesting critical discussions about the community from within the community. All that is to say, if we want something to get better, we have to be able to question it. The goal with every one of my videos is to treat people like they're intelligent and capable of critical thought. And that's what we're going to be doing here tonight. Thinking critically, both of us. Now it's worth mentioning we're going to be covering a lot of information in this video. So much that to try to fit it all in one video would have been folly. So we're splitting it up into parts. As some of you eagle-eyed viewers might notice, my background has changed. That's because this video ended up being longer than I expected, so now I'm going back and doing some snipping. So in part one here, we're going to cover how we can arrive at a suitable definition for the mainstream tradition of the word called jazz, the attitudes, beliefs, and personalities that caused it to become what it is, and the big reappraisal that changed the way musicians thought of jazz so much they completely abandoned everything that made it recognizable as jazz. And all the while, we'll talk about how the history and historiography reflects the black experience in America. This will be a common thread throughout the series. So, without further ado, let's get into it.
Everybody's gone to bed and sleep at nearby. Kids and movies are our sweet reveries. We present
When most people think about jazz as an art form, Who do you think about? Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Dexter Gordon, Joe Henderson, and maybe a couple more modern guys like Herbie Hancock or Robert Glasper or Terence Blanchard. But that's only part of the story. I've considered myself a student of jazz since I was about 14, but for a lot of people there's actually an enormous gap in knowledge. And I didn't realize that until I got to grad school and learned about all these people I had never even heard of before. So why hadn't I heard about them? Is it because they were worse as artists? Did they contribute less meaningful content to the body of work? No. In reality, the reason that a lot of us have never heard about these people has more to do with the subjective denotations of the word jazz itself. When you try to define jazz as a genre, a lot of critics and writers and researchers have noticed, it becomes difficult to write about through conventional models of jazz history. Because how can you meaningfully define an art that is defined by spontaneous invention? It's like trying to name a color that keeps changing. Writers, critics, and musicians alike have long explored this relationship between jazz and its tradition. Because in a music that changes as often as this one does, a lot of historiographers, who write about the history of something, have defined jazz as a music that is often deeply rooted in its own traditions. But that's still a really nebulous, subjective definition, and as you might imagine, it's still hotly debated today. The community can't decide. It's resulted in a lot of infighting, and because of that, we've got dozens of artists and decades worth of music that gets omitted from popular treatments of jazz history. And especially as we get later into the 20th century and more new popular styles were cropping up, rock and roll, soul, funk, disco, this historical oversight of jazz, which was increasingly being considered an art music, it might seem inconsequential, but tonight we're actually here to talk about why it's not. Namely because those omissions were not oversights, they were deliberate, and because that music is important for a lot of reasons. To begin with, it's probably pretty obvious, but treatments of history with deliberate omissions hurt the idiom, both at the musical and the community levels. When jazz is defined in such an intentionally exclusionary way, it silences non-conforming voices. And this specific issue speaks to larger problems in the Black community on the whole. I wasn't the first person to deal with the fallout from jazz debates, its roots and tradition, and the necessity of adhering to your past just to define your present. And unfortunately, I'm not going to be the last. But if there's one thing that is certain about the music, it's this. For jazz to reject its own core conventions was inevitable. And it was at this point that many people stopped not just teaching it, but writing about it too. So when I originally sat down, wrote the thesis, and did the research that I based this video off of, there were a couple of main questions I considered. How has the music known as jazz grown, evolved, or otherwise changed over the past 60 years? Why is it so often excluded from the tradition? Should it be excluded from the tradition? And as I was answering these questions, I found that the issue encompassed not just the jazz tradition, but the Black community on the whole. Because tonight, we're talking about misfits. And you're looking at one of them. Now, as I've said before, for jazz to go beyond the ken of what it originally was inevitable. But what was the ken? Because before we can talk meaningfully about stuff that falls outside of the tradition, we have to define the tradition. The one that guys like the Marsalis clan defend so fiercely. How are they defining it? Why are they defining it that way? Well, the answer has to do with what we in jazz call the mainstream tradition, which could more accurately be described as acceptable jazz. The historiographer Eric Porter offered up a nice definition that I think rounds out what most people consider to be acceptable jazz, defined by things like elements of swing, improvisation, a fusion of European and African musical devices, both in terms of instrumentation and technique, spontaneity, the sounds of popular Black music, whatever that is at the time, but also accessibility and experimentation are two things that factor into the music in a big way. But the thing about defining something is that you're putting a definition on it, which may seem self-explanatory, but what that means is that you're locking something into a rigid place with boundaries. Now, the pros and cons of boundaries are something we've talked about on this channel before, but we're going to talk about it a lot more tonight. And one of the disadvantages of boundaries is that such a rigid definition for such a fluid genre is always going to be incomplete somehow. Like, for example, if you took a swing chart like April in Paris or Stompin' at the Savoy and took out the solos, would you then just have pop music? Is it no longer jazz? Many musicians of the time did feel like swing-era music had become this over-commercialized parody of what jazz was supposed to be, and it was an enormous enterprise. It was the pop music of the time. Or consider the speed and complexity of the bop music that followed it, which came from musicians who were disgruntled with the conventions of swing. Louis Armstrong himself, who many people consider to be the godfather of jazz, could not stand bebop and took up arms against it. Bop music was intended to be difficult, inaccessible, not danceable, and ultimately anathema to swing. It was a music that was pretty much exclusively for musicians. It completely eschewed marketability and danceability for creative freedom, so it couldn't possibly have gone more against the grain. Yet now, it's the default language for jazz. The most glaring issue with this definition, though, is the exclusion of most jazz that was made post-1960. Although to mainstream's most staunch adherents, this music isn't worth defining anyway. As I just pointed out, within this relatively safe definition, we see a lot of self-contradictions. But because the sound of something is the easiest way to label and therefore limit a genre, this is how the music, and most music, is viewed typically. Styles like bop being bebop and hard bop, post-bop being cool jazz and some third stream stuff, swing music, and the styles that came before it like Chicago and stride, Dixieland, ragtime, and certain Latin jazz offshoots, they all fit kind of cozily into this definition. But now that we've looked at the issues with the popular definition, let's talk about the other way that some newer scholars are choosing to look at it. Now, the very nature of jazz is this spontaneous, inventive music that constantly encourages you to expand your boundaries, has prompted some scholars not to view jazz as the sum of its current elements, since the current elements are always changing, and more as a narrative of musical assimilation and evolution. The intent of the artist to experiment based on the traditions of the music, find their own voice, and to then push that music in new directions. To me, this is a more useful definition. As we've talked about, the music that we consider mainstream jazz now was at one point the new unpopular thing. And to me, the line that gets drawn in jazz a lot of the time has less to do with some of the music being authentic and inauthentic, and more to do with the most visible faces of the music now, kind of just defining what they consider to be authentic. And I bet you can guess who I'm talking about, but we'll get there later. And yeah, we're using this definition more for the misfits, but it's helpful for mainstream jazz too. Because like I just said, cool jazz was different from bebop, which was different from swing, which was different from stride and Dixieland. And along the lines of these two perspectives, the sound of the music versus the intent of the artist, this is where the battle's fought. And that battle, sound versus intent, is what we're going to explore tonight. As the 1950s came to an end and revolution fomented on the horizon, many musicians were more concerned with the expansion of the tradition than the adherence to it. Like we've already said, this is nothing new. The bop greats like Dizzy Gillespie and Thelonious Monk and Charlie Parker, the swing giants like Duke, Goodman, and Basie, and even the Chicago composers like Jelly Roll and Satchmo himself, they all sought answers to that same question. How do we grow while still staying rooted in what this already is? For the would-be practitioners of the new thing that was variously called the avant-garde or free jazz, the new music, great black music, which is what the Art Ensemble of Chicago called it, and I like that name the best, or simply just the music, to go beyond the sound, they had to go beyond the word jazz itself, and in so doing, go beyond the limitations they believe it imposed. Now, to a new, free, avant-garde musician, whatever term you want to use, what was jazz to them? Well, to answer that question, we've got to kind of go into the origins of how that word came to be used to define that music in the first place. Now, we're not going to get into the exact etymology because that's still something that people are arguing about. But one thing people are not arguing is that that word was most likely not used by the musicians of the time to describe the music they were making. And so the lofty ontological questions of nomenclature turn more into a socioeconomic discussion than anything. At the time, jazz was common turn-of-the-century New Orleans parlance meaning sex. So it's very likely that this term was used originally by white folks to refer to this new black music. To many conservative white folks of the time, jazz was too raunchy, too sinful, too sexual. And of course it was therefore likened to their word for sex. When you look at it this way, which was the perspective of many black musicians who did not like the word, jazz is less the music and more the thing the music was exploited into becoming, driven by a greater push for marketability and a lust for the money that could be made. In the words of the trumpeter Lee Morgan, it's not a word that we made up, it's a word where we were told what it was. Now, of course, keep in mind, white musicians and Creole musicians who are neither strictly white nor black were all involved in the creation of the music. So its definition as a black American art form is less about white folks not being involved at all, and more because it directly came about because of the blues, field hollers, shouts, all of those things that came directly from slave traditions and West Africa itself. Now to the new avant-garde musicians, the narrative of black music, not just jazz,
was as much about progress as it was the constant co-opting of the black idiom by white folks. For decades prior to the existence of jazz, it had been present in the form of minstrelsy, and that shadow loomed long over the first half of the 20th century. And it's been said a million times, but it really is inconceivable just how central minstrelsy was to American entertainment for a while. Concerns about palatability and image to the more economically able public, read white, would lead to all kinds of things. There was the sweeter type of jazz that was done by Glenn Miller and Paul Whiteman and the like. There was Benny Goodman's issues with integrating his trio, and the resentment that this pattern spawned would become a cornerstone in several attitudes of the new music. Charles Mingus, for example, would famously call out Paul Desmond of the Dave Brubeck Quartet for his supposed lack of swing. Now, a lot of people interpreted this as Mingus's frustration about the commodification of black music to be made whiter, and he was very far from the only musician to feel this way about the West Coast jazz scene. The resentment was so bad that it spawned an entire counter-movement on the East Coast called hard bop, but he did eventually walk this statement back and apologize for it. But what it all comes down to, the word jazz and the traditions that came with it were shackles. Black music bound within white economically driven parameters. These weren't unprecedented thoughts either. Like I mentioned earlier, bebop musicians abandoned swing because they were disillusioned with the over-commercialization of the music. Not to mention what they perceived to be Uncle Tom-ish attitudes towards the audience and performing. Now, this is an entire can of worms that we could have a whole separate video about, and maybe we will. But to briefly summarize, it involves the connotations of the word Dixieland. The long history of black performers having to adopt racially caricaturized personas just so they could have an opportunity to perform.
Why on earth would a black performer put on blackface and demean him or herself?
Look, this is the 19th century. They had limited options. They were expected to.
Why?
Because it made the audiences comfortable.
And the eventual association of traditional jazz coming from the South, or trad jazz as it's commonly known now, with the stereotypical image of the good Negro, which newer musicians unfortunately felt like guys like Louis Armstrong embodied. And after this critical reappraisal of the word jazz as symbolic of the co-opting of black music, these new musicians would choose to step away not just from the word, but the conventions of the genre itself. This is why they did it, and thus was born the new thing, great black music. Now, the most commonly spoken of trailblazers in the new music are Ornette Coleman and John Coltrane, and the pianist Cecil Taylor. But the seeds of this musical revolution had actually been planted several years earlier. Duke Ellington, king among swing-era giants, jazz writers, and American composers in general, had always been kind of a vanguard unto himself. His music made extensive use of polychords and discordant, sometimes even unpleasant growls and sound effects, but it came from a place that was deliberately rooted in things like field hollers and ring shouts, not to mention spirituals of the century prior. To Duke, this stuff was the original spirit of black music in America. And interestingly, and you can look this up if you don't believe me, Duke Ellington didn't like the word jazz either. He instead called what he did Negro folk art. Now, during his time at the Cotton Club, Duke Ellington was allowed to experiment with all kinds of cool textural stuff like jungle sounds, for example. Now, this is stuff that became more widely publicly known once the technology caught up to Duke Ellington's vision later on in his life. And now we can listen to stuff like A Drum is a Woman, but he had been doing stuff like that for a long time. Now, some might try to lump this in with Dixieland music, where a black man is playing into the image that is expected of him. But look at how he was dressed. Look at what he said about his art. So a lot of other musicians, and I'm sure Sir Duke himself, saw it instead as a deliberate reclamation and integration of those aspects of our heritage we've been told are savage and shameful. He, along with contemporaries like Max Roach and Sonny Rollins, were the true forebears of a more widespread tendency in the 60s towards a musical representation of the civil rights struggle and black nationalism. In this way, you can directly link Duke Ellington to the thoughts and attitudes and even sounds of the new musicians. Did you know any of that about Duke Ellington? If you did, you probably know a lot of what we're going to talk about in this video. Now let's talk about another early mainstream weirdo, Thelonious Monk, who just so happened to be one of my earliest inspirations. His abstractions were a very early example of bending the rules. And this was and is one of the most significant pianists and composers of the mainstream idiom.
Monk believed that good composition and good improvisation were interconnected, and as such, many of his works forced both the listener to hear differently and the performer to play differently. He may have defined his jagged harmonies with conventional notation, but the tone clusters, the dissonances, and the wide range of voices were a true harbinger of what was to come. Finally, let's talk about someone I didn't know about before I got to grad school, Lenny Tristano. This pianist was actually responsible for recording the first ever free group improvisations within the jazz idiom, and he did so with his sextet. This was an evolution of the freely expressive playing that Errol Garner had done a decade prior. Tristano was the guy who bridged the gap between swing piano language and the atonality that Cecil Taylor would meaningfully introduce. So now that we've covered both the attitudes and musicians building up to the scene, we're going to stop here for tonight. Tune in next time and we'll take a look at the people actually responsible for making the music. Beginning, of course, with Ornette Coleman. Don't miss it.